Hello everybody, welcome back to another Photoshop CS6 tutorial. Buddy Blackford here, and I'm going to show you how to use a couple different blurs today. Actually a few different blurs, so 3 different ones. I'm going to show you the box blur, the surface blur, and the shape blur. And those are all under the filters, where if I go to filter and then I go to blur, I can pick those different blurs. So the first one I want to start off with is the box blur. And you just apply the blur right to your layer and it's going to start blurring immediately, where you have the ability to change the radius of the blur, and that's pretty much it. So what a box blur is it pretty much takes a look-see at the pixels and then compares it to the pixels around it, and then averages these colors together to create a blur effect. So just to let you know that the box blur is not a realistic looking blur effect. It's mainly used in special effects, so if you're going for something that's not realistic looking, then go for the box blur. Okay, so you can adjust the radius down here. The blur gets larger when you move the radius to the right, as you can see here, and it just gets totally blurred out into gray if you go all the way out, and it gets less blurry as you move to the left. So that's for the box blur. So remember that the box blur is non-realistic and it just averages the pixels around and blurs them appropriately. The next blur that we're going to go over the surface blur. So filter, blur, and then let's go to surface blur, which is down here at the bottom. And it brings up the same thing, but now we have a threshold here. So the surface blur is a really good blur, and it pretty much smooths pixels that are different, but it leaves out like really drastic changes such as edges intact if you have it set up correctly. So if you don't want it really blurry and you want the edges to be intact, you just want to have the blur radius and threshold set down a little lower than they are right now, because right now it kind of looks cartoony, doesn't it? Alright, so the surface blur is good for reducing noise. It's good for smoothing out skin, like getting rid of wrinkles and retouching photos a little bit. So you don't want to go too crazy on your blur because it'll look weird, obviously. So I'm going to show you how to use this blur properly to, let's fix up like some of the skin and stuff like that. So I'm going to hit cancel real quick, and what I'm going to do is duplicate this layer. Here we go. And I'm going to apply the surface blur to the top layer. Filter, blur, surface blur. Okay, now what I'm going to do is adjust the radius, and this decreases or increases the amount of blur applied to the image. So I'm just going to decrease it just a little bit. 3. That looks kind of good. You can still see it's a little over the top, but we're gonna fix that. The threshold slider here decreases or increases like the shift in brightness, I guess. So if I move it all the way to the left, you can see what it does. You can see how it's a little different looking. And if I move it all the way to the right, you can see how that looks there. So it's kind of hard to explain. You kind of just you mess with it a little bit to figure out where you want your blur to be. So here it's kind of blurry on here. Looks like some of the skin's been blurred out, so it's like doesn't have like any imperfections and many imperfections and stuff like that. So I'm gonna hit OK. Now this doesn't look real, so what we're gonna do is just lower the opacity of this layer so this layer below that hasn't been affected shows through. So let's go click on our top layer, lower the opacity down, to something like this. And if I look in between these, you can see that the skin blurs a little bit. Now this isn't, you're not going to use this as the only way to smooth people's skin out and everything like that. This is a supporting way to use to smooth the skin, and just one way that you can use surface blur on images. So let's move on to the next blur, which is the shape blur. So I'm going to delete this layer copy off. And now we're left with our original image that has nothing done to it. Let's go filter, blur, and shape blur. And the shape blur is based on the shapes that you already have in Photoshop. So it could be based on this heart. Let me bring this down a little bit. Well, the lowest I can do that is 5. And yep, between 5 and 1,000. I don't know why they don't go down to like 1 or something like that, but that's Photoshop probably has a good idea. They made the program, I didn't. So if you want to add more types of images that you can blur off of, just click on this over here, and then you can replace your shapes here by adding in new ones. You can add in different types of shapes that you have already in Photoshop, like let me bring in like nature or something like that. And if I click OK, it's going to replace all of them. If I hit append, it's going to add them to the end. So I'm just going to hit append, and now I've got the different shapes here. Like this one might be cool. Well, they just give the like different blur effects. So you go through and pick which ones you kind of like. And obviously, when you're doing this, you can't really see the actual shape within the blur, which is probably a good thing, because who really wants to see that, honestly. But the way that the image is affects the blur. So we got this lightning shape here. Let me click on that. You can see our blur is a little more drastic, and if you compared like the blur to the lightning shape, it's like jaggedy. Now if I go to something smooth like this teardrop, the blur is a little more smoothed out. So that's what this shape blur is good for doing. So I'll just hit OK, and then we've got our blur on here. And remember that you can duplicate the layer and lower the opacity if you would like to add the blur in a lesser amount. Now, honestly, I don't really use the shape blur a lot, but I'm sure it has some good uses. Like when I was showing you, if you want a really intense blur, like use that like lightning bolt one, or if you want a smoother blur, use the teardrop like I was showing you. But I kind of feel that there's other ways to get better blurs, which I'll end up showing you in another tutorial that'll be coming up soon. So just keep in mind those different types of blurs: box blur, surface blur, and shape blur that we went over, and use them to your advantage when you need to. So now that you know about them, you can use them and implement them into your document. So thank you for watching this, guys, and I truly am thankful that you guys are watching the videos and giving me feedback and stuff like that on them. So I'll see you guys later in the next tutorial. It's going to be awesome, and I look forward to seeing you guys at it.